The chamber was hushed, though not silent. The faint scrape of pens, the shuffle of papers, the soft whir of cameras echoed against the marble walls of the Supreme Court, each sound amplified by the stillness of anticipation. This was not a typical hearing. Everyone inside the chamber could feel it. Something heavier was pressing down, like the weight of history itself had stepped into the room. Justice Clarence Thomas leaned forward, his dark eyes steady, his voice a slow drawl that carried the authority of decades spent robed in black. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, the syllables deliberate, each one carrying the sting of judgment, "you have disrespected tradition." The words struck the chamber like a hammer on steel. Tradition, spoken not as a principle but as a weapon, a reminder of who had always held the reins of power. Reporters at the back of the room bent over their notepads, frantic to capture the phrasing. Photographers raised their cameras, eager for the image of Crockett's reaction, an image they knew would ricochet across the nation by nightfall. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her posture deceptively calm. Beneath the table, her hand tightened, around the barrel of her pen, tapping once against the edge of her binder. Her eyes narrowed not in fear but in calculation. She had heard that word before. Tradition, used as both shield and sword. In law school classrooms, in legislative debates, in courtroom battles where she fought for clients who were told their rights were inconvenient to history. She breathed in, letting the weight of the accusation settle. A murmur rose among spectators, some leaning toward Thomas's side of the bench, others toward hers. The chamber had divided in an instant, just as the nation outside already had. Crockett's voice finally rose, even and deliberate. "Justice Thomas, with all due respect, tradition has always been defined by those who benefit most from it." A ripple passed through the crowd, audible gasps, scribbles of pens moving faster, the cameras clicking like a swarm of insects. Thomas's brow furrowed, a faint line of irritation cutting across his face. The narration of the moment was almost unspoken, yet undeniable. Here sat a Supreme Court justice, wielding the authority of centuries of precedent against a congresswoman, who had built her reputation not on preserving the old order, but on dismantling it when it served injustice. The clash was not simply about decorum or procedure. It was about whose voice could claim legitimacy in the most sacred chamber of American law. Thomas leaned back slightly, his voice cutting once more. "Tradition," he repeated slower this time, "is the foundation of stability in this republic. Without respect for it, we descend into chaos." Crockett tilted her head, eyes locked onto his. "Respect for tradition," she said, her words clear, "is not the same as obedience to silence. If tradition means ignoring the voices that history has excluded, then perhaps chaos is just another word for justice finally being heard." The chamber erupted, some in applause, some in boos. The Chief Justice rapped his gavel, calling for order, but the spark had already been struck. The exchange would not vanish into transcripts. It would explode across the country, replayed endlessly on television, dissected on social media, debated in classrooms and barbershops and kitchens. The moment had crystallized into something larger, the generational fault line between authority and defiance, between the stability of the past and the unrelenting demands of the present. And Jasmine Crockett, sitting tall in the face of condescension, had refused to bow. The battle lines were drawn. What followed would not just be argument, but a reckoning, one that promised to test not only the boundaries of the law but the soul of American democracy itself. The gavel's echo had barely faded before Karoline Leavitt adjusted the microphone before her. She straightened in her chair, the posture deliberate, shoulders squared as though she were preparing for battle. At just 27, she carried herself with the confidence of someone twice her age, but behind that confidence was calculation. Every syllable, every gesture, rehearsed for the cameras she knew were watching. She leaned in, her voice sharp, pitched to cut through the noise. "The American people," she began, "are tired of professional victims masquerading as leaders. They want action, not lectures. They want truth, not theater." The words landed like darts, designed for headlines, for viral clips that would play endlessly across social media feeds by nightfall. Reporters scribbled furiously, glancing up with the kind of alertness that said they'd heard the bait. The audience inside the chamber murmured, shifting uneasily, sensing the escalation. Jasmine Crockett remained still. Her pen hovered above her binder, but she did not write. She simply listened, her gaze locked on Leavitt, the kind of gaze that suggested patience but also promised that patience would not last long. Leavitt pressed forward, her tone quickening as though emboldened by the silence across from her. "This Congresswoman," she said, gesturing sharply in Crockett's direction, "would rather divide this nation by race and gender than unite it under the values that made America strong. She speaks for elites, for activists in ivory towers, but not for the working families who can't afford gas, groceries, or housing." The accusation hung heavy in the chamber, sharper than Thomas's earlier words. It was not only political, it was personal. A calculated attempt to delegitimize Crockett not just as a lawmaker, but as a voice of authority. Crockett's jaw tightened, but still she remained silent. The silence itself became part of the spectacle, a canvas on which Leavitt painted her attack. Leavitt's words sharpened further, the cadence accelerating, the volume rising just enough to sound impassioned but not uncontrolled. The people are sick of being lectured to by those who profit off their pain, and they are sick of representatives who play identity politics as a shield against accountability. If America is going to survive, we need leaders who build, not leaders who divide. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A few members of the audience applauded softly, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The chamber itself felt divided into two Americas, one that cheered the indictment of so-called identity politics, and one that bristled at the erasure of lived experience. Narration framed the moment. Karoline Leavitt was young, but she was not naive. She had mastered the rhythm of political theater, the art of turning an opponent's strength into a caricature. She spoke not to persuade the chamber, but to ignite her base beyond it, to produce sound bites that could live forever in the digital bloodstream. Still, beneath the polish, there was something brittle. The confidence looked solid, but it was the kind that cracked under real pressure. Every line was a script, every gesture borrowed from campaigns past. She was fighting not with experience, but with echoes. The room grew still again as Leavitt leaned back, satisfied as if she had delivered the final word. She folded her notes neatly, placing them on the desk with a sharp little smile that suggested triumph. But the camera panned not to her, but to Jasmine Crockett. Crockett sat unmoved, her pen tapping once, twice against the table. Her expression was unreadable. Neither anger nor amusement, but something deeper. Calculation. Strategy. The quiet confidence of someone who had fought bigger battles than this, and won. The murmurs began again, louder this time, the spectators sensing the air shift. Crockett's silence was not weakness. It was a prelude. She was letting the performance run its course, knowing that when her turn came, it would not be scripted sound bites, but a dismantling, piece by piece, of everything Leavitt had thrown. Cameras zoomed in on her eyes. The stillness was electric, suspense stretched to its breaking point. Leavitt had spoken her salvo. Now the chamber, and the nation, waited for the reply that everyone knew was coming. The chamber vibrated with the residue of Karoline Leavitt's words, a cocktail of applause, gasps, and the faint scratch of reporters transcribing history in real time. The younger woman leaned back in her chair, lips pursed with the satisfaction of someone who believed they had landed the winning blow. But across the table, Jasmine Crockett had not moved. Her pen hovered over her notes, its tip suspended a millimeter above the page. She did not write. She simply tapped once, twice, the sound soft but rhythmic, like a heartbeat keeping her centered in the storm. The silence was unsettling. It stretched long enough to feel intentional. Leavitt tilted her head, her confidence flickering as she waited for the explosion she had expected. She had delivered her lines with precision, and yet Crockett had not given her the satisfaction of an immediate counterattack. Instead, Crockett's stillness turned into its own spectacle, drawing every eye in the chamber toward her. Narration wrapped the moment in atmosphere. Crockett knew the art of timing. In a courtroom, she had learned that silence could be louder than shouting, that waiting just long enough forced the opponent's words to rot under their own weight. Finally, she looked up, her eyes locking on Leavitt's. Calm, steady, almost amused. "Ms. Leavitt," she began, her voice low but clear enough to cut through the air. "I know a lot of folks your age believe politics is just a stage for clout, but let me remind you, this is not TikTok, this is Congress, and truth still matters here." The words detonated like a charge beneath the chamber. Reporters froze, pens suspended. The audience shifted, murmuring as though they had all felt the ground shift beneath them. Leavitt blinked, the faintest crack in her mask of composure. She opened her mouth, but Crockett's gaze held her still, as if daring her to speak. Crockett leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk with a deliberate, "Come, you came here to lecture about identity politics, to call me a professional victim. But let me tell you something. I've stood in courtrooms with mothers who had to choose between paying bail and feeding their children. I've defended men whose only crime was existing in the wrong skin at the wrong time. That's not theater. That's survival." Gasps echoed through the gallery. The atmosphere thickened with the weight of testimony not just spoken, but lived. Leavitt's eyes darted toward the cameras, searching for rescue in the glow of the lenses. But the cameras had already chosen their subject. They were fixed on Crockett, on the slow rise of her voice, on the undeniable authority of someone who had walked the talk before speaking it. Crockett continued, her tone sharpened now, her words like a scalpel. "You speak about real America as if it belongs only to your side of the aisle. But real America is the grandmother on food stamps, the veteran denied care, the kid walking home past neighborhoods where opportunity died a long time ago. And when you dismiss their struggles as victimhood, you tell the whole world you've never listened to them in the first place." The chamber stirred, a ripple of applause rising before the gavel slammed against the bench, calling for order. But order had already been broken. Leavitt sat rigid, her smile brittle now, the smugness replaced by unease. Crockett, by contrast, leaned back slowly, reclaiming her silence, letting her words linger in the air like smoke after a fire. Narration lingered on the contrast, one woman armed with rehearsed lines, the other with lived scars. The audience felt the distinction deep in their bones because it was not simply a debate, it was exposure. The nation had seen Karoline Leavitt speak first, but now they had witnessed Jasmine Crockett's poise, her restraint, and the slow uncoiling of power that comes not from volume but from truth that cannot be rehearsed. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, waiting, ready for the next strike in a battle that was far from over. The tension in the chamber had reached a breaking point. Jasmine Crockett sat composed, her quiet poise still echoing in the air. But now came the pivot, the moment where silence turned into a storm. She flipped open her binder, her fingers brushing across highlighted passages and neatly tabbed documents. It was not for show. Each page was a weapon, each fact a blade honed sharp from years of courtroom battles. She glanced once more at Karoline Leavitt, who sat straighter, perhaps trying to mask the sudden unease settling across her features. Crockett's voice came steady, deliberate. "You say the American people are tired of lectures, Ms. Leavitt, but what they are truly tired of is being lied to." The words landed with a thud of finality, and she began her dismantling. She raised her first point, citing the GOP's voting record on health care. "You talk about working families, yet your party voted against expanding rural hospital funding. The same hospitals those families rely on when their children are sick. That is not unity. That is abandonment." Leavitt shifted, a flicker of irritation across her face. She interjected quickly, her voice sharp. "That's not what I said." Crockett's gaze sliced through her attempt. "No, Ms. Leavitt, that's exactly what you said. And it's exactly why Americans are tired of sound bites with no substance." The gallery reacted audibly. Some gasped, others clapped before being hushed by the gavel. Reporters' pens scratched, with renewed urgency, capturing a moment that was already destined for the evening news cycle. Crockett leaned closer to the microphone, her tone sharper now, infused with both authority and disdain. You accuse me of identity politics, but let's be real. Identity is not a shield. It is reality. And if you want to talk about division, look no further than policies that pit neighbor against neighbor, that strip rights from some while protecting privilege for others. Leavitt bristled, fumbling for a rebuttal. You're twisting my words. The GOP stands for the people who've been ignored by elites. Crockett cut her off, her tone rising just enough to command the room. Ignored? The only people ignored are the ones your party steps over while you lecture about tradition. I fought in courtrooms for clients who didn't have a microphone. You, Ms. Leavitt, are fighting for headlines. There's a difference, the SAR. Chamber erupted again, louder this time. The Chief Justice's gavel pounded, but the applause drowned him out for a long electric moment. Cameras zoomed in on Leavitt's stiffened jaw, her hands clasped too tightly in front of her, betraying the strain beneath the polished veneer. Narration painted the shift. Crockett was no longer on defense. She had seized the offensive, dragging Leavitt's talking points into the harsh light of evidence. The fight was no longer between equals in rhetoric. It was between practiced theater and lived truth. Crockett closed her binder, the motion deliberate, final, as if to say she had proven her point without needing to belabor it. She rested, her hands on the table, and fixed her eyes on Leavitt with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove, only truths left to expose. History doesn't remember who shouted the loudest, she said, her tone measured but searing. It remembers who stood on the side of justice even when it was inconvenient. So if you came here to play politics, you should have stayed on Twitter. This chamber deserves more. The silence that followed was not empty. It was deafening. Even those who had sided with Leavitt moments before shifted uneasily, recognizing that Crockett's words had cut deeper than any slogan could. Leavitt's mouth opened as though to speak, but no words came. She glanced toward the cameras again, searching for escape in their glow. But the cameras were locked on Crockett, and the nation knew instinctively. This was the moment the clash had turned. The first blow had been struck, and it was devastating. What remained was not a debate, but a reckoning that would only intensify with every exchange to come. The chamber feels like it is split across time itself. On one side, the weight of the past, Justice Clarence Thomas, decades on the bench, a man whose very name has become synonymous with the old guard of constitutional interpretation. His voice, stern and immovable, represents a worldview where tradition is sacred and dissent is suspect. On the other side, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, young, unrelenting, her tone sharp with a truth forged in the fires of lived experience. Every sentence she utters slices through the air with the energy of a generation unwilling to be silent. Tradition? Crockett says, her voice rising with each syllable. Tradition is women being told they're too loud. Tradition is black leaders being told to wait their turn. Tradition is young voices being told they don't belong at the table. Gasps ripple through the chamber. Karoline Leavitt shifts uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the tide. This is no longer about decorum. It is about who gets to decide the terms of justice. Justice Thomas counters, his tone dismissive. Without tradition, Congresswoman, this institution crumbles. Do you propose chaos in its place? Crockett leans forward, steady but searing. No. I propose truth. And truth doesn't crumble when tested. It gets stronger. The ideological chasm is laid bare. Generational, cultural, moral. 2. Americas staring each other down, each convinced the other threatens the nation's survival. And in this crackling tension, the audience watching across the country knows. One of them will emerge diminished, the other emboldened. The chamber has become more than a court. It is now a battlefield of legacies. The tension in the chamber had reached a fever pitch. Jasmine Crockett's words had not just landed. They had dug trenches, dividing spectators along ideological and generational lines. But she was far from finished. This was no longer a sparring match of rhetoric. It was time for evidence to speak louder than sound bites. She opened her binder deliberately, revealing meticulously organized documents, public records, and voting logs. Each sheet was a weapon honed for precision, each fact chosen to expose the gaps in Leavitt's carefully constructed narrative. Cameras swiveled toward her, capturing every movement, every slight adjustment of her posture that radiated confidence and command. "You claim to speak for working families," Crockett began, her voice calm but penetrating. "Yet your record and the record of those you defend tells a different story." She laid down the first sheet, the edges crisp under the fluorescent lights. "Your party voted against rural hospital funding, against disaster relief for small towns, against programs that actually support the people you claim to champion. This is not opinion. These are public records, verifiable facts." Leavitt's composure cracked. Her practiced smile faltered, and she fumbled with her notes, searching for words that could fill the cavernous space Crockett's evidence had created. "Those votes," she began, but Crockett cut her off effortlessly. "No, Ms. Leavitt, those votes are precisely why people are frustrated. Your talking points claim empathy, but the facts demonstrate neglect." The gallery was silent, hanging on every word. Reporters' pens scratched furiously, capturing the moment in real time. Every camera angle favored Crockett now. The congresswoman, with the binder full of truth, the young operative floundering under scrutiny. The optics were undeniable. One side armed with lived experience and accountability, the other armed with rehearsed lines and media training. Crockett's pace was measured, her cadence rhythmic, each statement punctuated with purpose. "You accuse me of playing identity politics," she said, leaning closer to the microphone. "But let's call it what it is. I defend people who have been systematically silenced. You speak for those who have always been heard, and in doing so you erase the struggles of the majority you claim to represent." Leavitt opened her mouth to interject, but her words were caught in the sudden weight of evidence. Every line Crockett delivered had been anticipated, researched, and rehearsed for the singular effect of dismantling her opponent's facade. "And let's be clear," Crockett continued, her eyes sweeping the room with calm authority. "This is not a personal attack. This is accountability. When you stand here claiming the moral high ground, the American people deserve to see whether your record supports your rhetoric, and in this case, it does not." A murmur rose in the chamber. Spectators shifted in their seats. Some nodded, some shook their heads, and the camera zoomed in on Leavitt's forced composure, now visibly strained. Crockett's voice, steady and resolute, reverberated beyond the walls of the courtroom. Every soundbite, every carefully chosen statistic would be dissected on social media within minutes. Narration framed the moment. Crockett had moved from eloquent rebuttal to irrefutable evidence. What had begun as a clash of words had transformed into a reckoning with reality. Soundbites and theatrics could no longer compete with the weight of truth laid bare. Leavitt, now visibly flustered, shuffled papers and glanced toward the cameras, desperate for a lifeline. But the spotlight had shifted irreversibly. Crockett had seized not just the narrative, but the moral authority of the chamber itself. Her final words in this volley rang out with precision, a combination of gravity and clarity. "If leadership is measured by empathy, accountability, and courage, then your record speaks louder than your speeches. And today the people are listening." The chamber was electric with tension. Applause rose and fell, stifled by the gavel, yet impossible to suppress entirely. The battle had moved beyond personalities. It was now a public reckoning. Crockett had delivered the first decisive blow with facts as her weapon. And Leavitt, for all her preparation, had no answer strong enough to match the truth in front of a national audience, watching in real time. The chamber was heavy with anticipation. Every rustle of paper, every click of a camera shutter seemed amplified, echoing off the marble walls as though the room itself were holding its breath. Karoline Leavitt's composure, once so polished and rehearsed, was beginning to fracture. The young operative had faced scrutiny before, but never on a stage this vast. Never with the nation watching every gesture, every syllable. Jasmine Crockett, however, remained a study in calculated calm. Her pen still hovered above her binder, her eyes fixed on her opponent not with malice but with unyielding resolve. She had set the tone in previous rounds. First silence, then precise dismantling, followed by irrefutable evidence. Now she prepared for the final escalation, the moment where logic, morality, and public accountability would converge to expose not just weak arguments, but the core of character. Leavitt cleared her throat, her voice a fraction higher than usual, betraying tension. "Congresswoman Crockett, Crockett interrupted effortlessly, her words slicing through the chamber like a scalpel. "Ms. Leavitt, let's not pretend this is about a debate. This is about accountability. And accountability cannot be performed in sound bites or hashtags. It requires honesty. It requires courage. It requires the willingness to face facts, not narratives you hope will go viral." A subtle shiver ran through Leavitt's shoulders. She opened her binder and shuffled pages, trying to find a lifeline, but it was clear that the carefully rehearsed talking points could not match the precision of Crockett's methodical assault. Each document, each cited vote, each record laid bare was a mirror reflecting her own shortcomings, and the chamber seemed to sense it. "Look around you," Crockett continued, her tone unwavering. "The people you claim to represent are watching. They are not impressed by theatrics. They are not swayed by rehearsed indignation. They want to see whether their leaders actually act on their promises or simply recycle slogans." Leavitt's eyes flicked to the audience, searching for an ally among the journalists. A sympathetic nod, any sign of reprieve. But the cameras were fixed on Crockett now, her expressions framed perfectly, each pause weighted with intent. The nation beyond the chamber, millions of viewers, felt the tension mounting. The spectacle was no longer just political theater. It was a public reckoning. Crockett leaned in, her voice lower, more precise, a controlled force that drew attention like gravity. "You accuse me of division, yet your own record, your own words, betray a strategy built on creating contrast instead of consensus. You attack identity, yet fail to understand that identity is lived experience. When you dismiss people's struggles as performance, the real victims suffer. That is the division you perpetuate, not the solution you claim to offer." A murmur ran through the chamber. Leavitt's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted her papers. Her face, once animated with confidence, now bore the strain of confrontation, the subtle panic of someone realizing that their script has failed. Crockett did not relent. She raised another sheet of evidence, placing it carefully on the desk. "And let's be precise. Your narrative about championing working families? Let's look at the record. Opposition to rural health care, obstruction of small business aid during crises, denial of funds for disaster relief. These aren't abstract criticisms, these are verifiable failures." Leavitt swallowed hard, her lips pressed together. The faintest flicker of frustration passed over her features. For a moment she attempted to interject, but Crockett's gaze held her in place, not accusatory, not condescending, but immovable. The power in that silence was electric. Narration carried the weight of the moment. This was the breaking point. Crockett's strategy had been precise from the start. Let the opponent speak first, absorb the theatrics, respond with quiet authority, then strike with facts that could not be dismissed. The young GOP operative had entered thinking she could dominate with charisma, but charisma alone falters against preparation, experience, and unassailable evidence. Crockett's voice rose slightly, searing, deliberate. "The people are watching, Ms. Leavitt. They are watching for courage. They are watching for honesty. And right now you are failing them. They deserve better than rehearsed outrage. They deserve leaders who act, who listen, who understand the weight of the office they hold." The chamber was silent save for the faint clicking of pens. Spectators leaned forward, the air thick with suspense. Even the most partisan observers had to acknowledge the power of what was unfolding. A young, seasoned congresswoman, systematically unraveling an opponent's narrative in front of the entire nation. Leavitt's eyes darted to the ceiling, to the cameras, to the floor, searching for a foothold that didn't exist. Her voice cracked ever so slightly as she whispered almost to herself, I... Crockett's calm returned instantly, her expression unreadable, a masterful conductor of tension. "It's okay, Ms. Leavitt. You've done your best. But your best is not enough when truth stands in the light, and the light of scrutiny is unforgiving." The chamber seemed to exhale collectively. Applause and murmurs mixed with the gavel's repeated strikes calling for order, yet the impact had already been made. Leavitt, the confident young operative, had faltered. Crockett had seized the moral high ground, the narrative, and the nation's attention, all in one unflinching display of strategy and truth. And as cameras panned across the chamber, capturing the stark contrast between faltering youth and composed authority, it became clear the breaking point had been reached, and the battle had shifted irrevocably in favor of Jasmine Crockett. The moment had left the chamber electric, but the reverberations quickly escaped its marble walls. Outside, across the nation, millions of Americans were glued to live streams, cable news, and social media feeds. Every word, every gesture, every pause had been captured, dissected, and amplified. Crockett's methodical takedown of Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a courtroom spectacle. It had become a cultural flashpoint, a viral storm of political and social commentary. News anchors replayed her statements in slow motion, breaking down each fact, each line of reasoning. "You can see her precision," one analyst said, pointing to the binder Crockett had used as evidence. "She's not just rebutting arguments, she's dismantling an entire narrative in real time." Tweets began to trend within minutes. Clips of her calm but piercing remarks were shared with commentary ranging from awe to outrage. Jasmine Crockett, Karoline Leavitt, and political Clapback lit up the platforms. In living rooms and offices, people argued over what they had just witnessed. Some cheered, thrilled that a public official had dared to confront a rehearsed political operative with undeniable truth. Others grumbled, defensive for the young GOP operative, insisting she had been unfairly ambushed by a more experienced opponent. But no one could ignore it. The moment had become a referendum not only on policy, but on style, strategy, and generational authority. Crockett's lines were quoted again and again. "Truth doesn't crumble when tested. It gets stronger." People marveled at the audacity of her calm in a chamber that had become electric with partisan tension. Memes and commentary spread almost instantaneously. One showing Leavitt's tightening jaw, another highlighting Crockett's steady pen tap as a symbol of patience and power. Every frame told a story of experience triumphing over rehearsal, of authority grounded in evidence versus bravado without substance. Even political pundits were forced to acknowledge the moment. One veteran commentator noted, "We've seen many young operatives try to dominate a narrative, but very rarely do we see someone dismantled with such precision in real time. Crockett didn't shout, she didn't posture, she let the facts speak, and the nation listened." Narration framed the significance. The chamber had been a microcosm of the larger American political divide, a generational and ideological collision that now radiated outward. It wasn't simply about Leavitt or Crockett. It was about who the public chose to trust, whose approach resonated with citizens navigating crises, uncertainty, and the constant noise of partisan media. Crockett's authority wasn't performative. It was earned through lived experience, preparation, and moral clarity. Meanwhile, Leavitt's media team scrambled. Clips of her floundering attempts to interject were circulating alongside Crockett's composed, articulate responses. Analysts dissected every facial expression, every tremor in her voice, contrasting her rehearsed bravado with Crockett's controlled force. Comments ranged from sympathetic to scathing. "She's inexperienced," wrote one viewer. "She's a robot reading lines," wrote another. The consensus began to emerge. Crockett had won the debate in the court of public opinion as decisively as she had in the chamber. Even the Capitol's political insiders began whispering. Strategists noted that this encounter would be dissected for months. Campaign teams analyzed video clips for lessons, some trying to emulate Leavitt's media agility, others inspired by Crockett's calm, evidence-driven authority. The battle had transcended a single hearing. It had become a case study in political communication, a lesson in preparation and composure under scrutiny. Crockett herself, moments after leaving the chamber, walked through the corridors with quiet dignity. Reporters called out, but she did not engage in theatrics or boast. Her statement to the press was measured. I did my duty. I presented facts. I upheld my responsibility to the people. That's all that matters. The calm humility only amplified the impact of her words and actions. The narration captured the larger truth. In a world saturated with political spectacle, moments of authenticity and precision cut through noise like a blade. Crockett's poised dismantling of Leavitt was not just a clash of personalities. It was a masterclass in how truth, preparation, and moral clarity could dominate over rehearsed bravado and superficial confidence. As evening fell, social media continued to explode. Clips from the chamber were shared millions of times. Hashtags trended, memes proliferated. And the nation, for a brief but electric moment, was united in fascination, awe, or outrage at the spectacle they had just witnessed. The chamber may have been emptying, but the battle had only widened, from marble floors to millions of screens, from paper records to global discourse. The stakes were no longer personal. They were cultural, political, and symbolic. And the momentum was unmistakably clear. Jasmine Crockett had seized the narrative, leaving Karoline Leavitt struggling in the wake of truth laid bare. The chamber was electric, charged with the weight of expectation. Cameras swiveled, reporters held their breath, and the audience inside the marble walls seemed suspended in anticipation. Weeks of preparation, years of training, and decades of institutional memory had all led to this singular moment, the final exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt. Leavitt, visibly strained now, adjusted her notes for what seemed like the 100th time. Her confident facade had begun to crumble under Crockett's unrelenting precision. Every point she had hoped would land had been anticipated, deconstructed, and countered. The nation outside was already watching, waiting for the crescendo, the moment that would define not just the hearing, but the political careers and public perceptions of both women. Crockett's gaze was unwavering. Her pen tapped lightly on her binder, a metronome counting the seconds until she would strike decisively. Ms. Leavitt, she began, calm, deliberate. You've tried to frame this as a lecture about accountability, but what I see is someone clinging to rhetoric while ignoring reality. The words cut through the chamber, precise and unflinching. Leavitt opened her mouth, but Crockett held the space with the authority of someone who had faced scrutiny far fiercer than rehearsed speeches. You talk about unity, Crockett continued, leaning slightly forward, but your record divides. You speak for real America, yet your votes, your actions, and your words leave countless families behind. That's not unity. That's negligence disguised as political theater. Leavitt's hands trembled as she reached for her papers, the rehearsed cadence of her speech faltering. Her voice was higher now, tighter. I... Crockett's response was swift, slicing the tension like a blade. Let me finish, Ms. Leavitt. The people are not impressed by rehearsed outrage. They are impressed by results, by integrity, by accountability. And the record is clear. You have yet to demonstrate any of these. The chamber stirred. Applause threatened to break out, but the gavel's hammer kept it at bay. Every camera angle captured the juxtaposition. Leavitt's tense, faltering posture versus Crockett's calm, commanding presence. Social media feeds outside were already exploding with clips of the exchange, hashtags multiplying by the minute. Young Crockett Clapback, Kaska Truth in Chamber. Young Karoline flounders. Crockett leaned back slightly, letting the silence hang just long enough for the weight of her words to sink in. Then she delivered the final blow, the one that would echo across newsrooms, living rooms, and Twitter feeds for days. You've attempted to lecture me about working families while opposing the very measures that help them. You've attacked identity and dismissed lived experience, but let me be clear. Identity is reality, and reality cannot be silenced by rehearsed rhetoric. Today, the truth has spoken louder than your soundbites ever could. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps and whispers filled the chamber. Leavitt's jaw tightened. She swallowed, searching for a comeback that no longer existed. Crockett's words were not just a rebuttal, they were a verdict. Narration captured the significance. This was more than a political takedown. It was a collision of authenticity against performance, substance against style, lived experience against rehearsed talking points. Crockett had wielded facts, moral authority, and composure like weapons, and Leavitt had been left exposed. The audience understood the stakes, not as partisan talking points, but as a lesson in integrity, preparation, and courage under pressure. Leavitt finally managed a weak protest, her voice small and tentative. "That's not fair." Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice calm but resolute, almost editorial. "Fairness is irrelevant when the record speaks for itself. What matters is accountability, Ms. Leavitt, and the people are watching. They see who is prepared, who is truthful, and who is willing to defend the vulnerable rather than exploit them." The chamber held its collective breath. Reporters scribbled, cameras panned, and the national audience felt the seismic shift. Crockett's poise and command had transformed what was a tense debate into a defining moment of public reckoning. Leavitt, realizing the finality of the exchange, sank slightly in her chair. The rehearsed speeches, the polished lines, the confident gestures, all had failed to withstand the force of Crockett's truth. Narration emphasized the turning point. In a political climate dominated by spectacle, the quiet, precise, and morally grounded voice of Jasmine Crockett had risen above the noise. Her victory was not loud or flashy, it was undeniable. It was the kind of moment that would be replayed, studied, and remembered as a masterclass in strategy, preparation, and integrity. As Crockett collected her binder and straightened her notes, the chamber seemed to exhale collectively. Cameras lingered on her calm expression, the slow confidence of someone who had navigated not just political theater, but the real stakes of public trust and accountability. The climax had been reached. The confrontation had peaked. And in that moment, one thing was clear. Jasmine Crockett had not only won the exchange, she had set a standard for political courage that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the Supreme Court. The chamber had emptied, but the echoes of confrontation lingered in the marble halls. Jasmine Crockett gathered her notes with deliberate calm, each movement precise, each gesture measured. She had walked into the hearing poised, navigated a storm of rhetoric, dismantled Karoline Leavitt's arguments, and emerged not only victorious in the moment, but in the court of public opinion. The gavel had fallen, but the resonance of her performance would continue to reverberate across the nation. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. News networks replayed the final exchange endlessly, commentators dissecting each line, each expression. Clips of Crockett's poised delivery and Leavitt's faltering performance circulated like wildfire across social media. Memes, hashtags, and viral threads proliferated, cementing the narrative. Truth, preparation, and lived experience had triumphed over rehearsed bravado. Crockett wins, truth over theatrics, political masterclass were trending, each tag a digital monument to the moment. Crockett herself remained composed. She offered no gloating, no theatrics, only measured remarks to the press. "I did what I came here to do, present facts, defend the people, and uphold accountability. That is the responsibility of anyone who serves in public office. Nothing more, nothing less." Her humility only amplified the power of her victory. The nation saw not just a politician, but a leader who could act under pressure, grounded in principle and experience. Karoline Leavitt, by contrast, faced the consequences of her performance. Media analysts dissected her faltering attempts, her reliance on rehearsed lines, and her visible unease. Social media audiences debated her credibility, some sympathetic to her youth and inexperience, others critical of her inability to withstand scrutiny. The contrast between her performance and Crockett's was stark, instructive, and unrelenting. In this public reckoning, The young operative had been exposed, her polished image undone by the weight of truth and accountability. Narration framed the larger significance. In a political landscape often dominated by spectacle and superficiality, moments like these serve as reminders that substance ultimately prevails. Crockett's approach, calm, deliberate, rooted in moral clarity and facts, set a new benchmark. Leadership, the nation was reminded, is not about theatrics, hashtags, or viral lines. It is about courage, preparation, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, even when doing so carries personal and political risk. The hearing's fallout extended beyond the chamber. Congressional aides, political strategists, and veteran journalists studied the clips as case studies in effective political communication. Crockett's methods, the patient absorption of an opponent's attacks, the meticulous preparation of evidence, the precise timing of rebuttals, became the blueprint for navigating high-stakes political encounters. Meanwhile, Leavitt's approach was examined as a cautionary tale of overconfidence and reliance on style over substance. Even among the public, Crockett's victory inspired discourse that transcended partisanship. Citizens debated the substance of her points, the importance of moral accountability, and the power of grounded leadership. The narrative had shifted. No longer was the discussion about who shouted the loudest or who had the flashiest delivery. It was about who could stand firm in truth under intense scrutiny. Crockett returned to her office later that evening, the hum of the city outside her window a quiet reminder that the battle extended far beyond one chamber. She reflected not on victory, but on responsibility, the real work that awaited in serving her constituents, addressing systemic issues, and upholding the principles she had defended so publicly. The spectacle had passed, but the obligations remained, heavier and more enduring than any viral moment. In the end, the poetic justice was clear. The chamber, a symbol of centuries of authority, had witnessed a generational and ideological reckoning. The young operative, polished and confident, had faltered under scrutiny. The seasoned, principled leader, grounded in lived experience and meticulous preparation, had prevailed. It was not a triumph of personality, but a triumph of integrity, of courage, and of the enduring power of truth. As cameras continued to capture the emptying chamber, the narration concluded. History does not remember those who sought applause, who relied on rehearsed charm, or who wielded slogans as shields. History remembers those who, under pressure and against opposition, stood firm in principle. Jasmine Crockett had done just that. The nation had witnessed it, and the lesson, precise, unwavering, and unforgettable, would resonate far beyond this chamber for years to come. The gavel's echo faded. The chamber was quiet, but the impact of the confrontation, the clash of ideas, the exposure of truth, and the victory of substance over style would echo in the conscience of the nation indefinitely. Even after the cameras had gone dark, the echoes of the hearing reverberated across the nation. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Karoline Leavitt had transcended politics, becoming a defining moment in public consciousness, a masterclass in accountability, preparation, and moral authority. But beyond the viral clips and trending hashtags lay a subtler, more enduring impact, the shaping of perceptions, careers, and the broader political landscape. Crockett's meticulous approach, her calm demeanor, and her strategic deployment of facts had left an indelible impression. Scholars, political strategists, and journalists dissected her methods for lessons. University courses in political communication and leadership began including her performance as a case study. Her ability to command authority without aggression, to dismantle opposition with evidence rather than theatrics, became a benchmark for effective political discourse in an age dominated by media spectacle. Leavitt's trajectory, by contrast, faced scrutiny. Analysts debated whether her failure was a result of youth, overconfidence, or a lack of preparation, yet even critics acknowledged that the episode was instructive. In an era where charisma often overshadows substance, there remains a space for rigor, integrity, and composure. The lesson was clear. Performance without depth is ephemeral. Truth is enduring. The public reaction evolved over weeks. Social media conversations moved from immediate shock and fascination to deeper reflection on accountability, generational leadership, and systemic issues. Crockett's lines, particularly her assertion that truth doesn't crumble when tested, it gets stronger, were quoted not just in political discourse, but in broader cultural commentary, podcasts, editorial columns, and televised. Panels referenced the exchange repeatedly, framing it as a moment when substance prevailed over spectacle and evidence over empty rhetoric. Political allies recognized the significance as well. Colleagues in Congress saw Crockett as a figure who could navigate high-pressure scenarios with strategic clarity. Her ability to command attention without resorting to anger or exaggeration offered a model for how principled leadership could resonate across party lines. Even opponents, while reluctant to admit it publicly, acknowledged the precision and effectiveness of her approach. The hearing also prompted institutional reflection. Legislative staffers and media consultants began revisiting how politicians engage with evidence, argumentation, and public accountability. Crockett's example demonstrated that preparation, moral clarity, and measured execution could alter the dynamics of a confrontation, a lesson with implications far beyond one chamber, one hearing, or one political moment. Meanwhile, the viral nature of the event cemented its place in public memory. Clips, analysis, and memes persisted in the digital ecosystem, resurfacing in discussions about integrity, leadership, and accountability. For many, Crockett became a symbol of how the younger generation of lawmakers could assert influence effectively, combining intellect, experience, and moral authority to chawl.